2022, she completed her monograph titled Judging Jewish Identity in the United States, in which she examines why and how anti-Semitism came to be regarded legally as a race-based crime through the case Shaare Tefila Foundation versus Cobb, which is from the Supreme Court in 1987. Additionally, she has published in Religion Compass, Critical Research on Religion, and 2 chapters in edited volumes, Judaism, Race and Ethics, Approaches and Conversations, and Who is a Jew? Reflections on History, Religion, and Culture. Previously, she taught at Wesleyan University and UC Santa Barbara, where she received her PhD in 2010. Annalise.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Rabbi Lehman for that wonderful introduction, some of which I sent to you, but, oh, okay. Can you all hear me? No. Can I just take it?
You could.
Great, awesome. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Lehman, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure to write about this congregation, both the legal actions that you have taken against anti-Semitism and the work that you have done to connect with your neighbors in support of these legal actions. I really appreciate you and the time that I spent with your congregation. I know that Bess and Jack Teller are here somewhere in the front. And I really appreciate those of you, maybe some of you are out there somewhere, who allowed me to interview when I visited or over the phone in 2008 and 2009. And I've also had conversations with new friends since then. So as Rabbi Jonah Lehman mentioned, 15 years ago when I was writing my dissertation in religious studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, I found a reference to Shaare Tefila Congregation v. Cobb in a book called The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity by Eric L. Goldstein, which I really recommend. I then read the oral argument for the case, and it soon became my dissertation topic. And as of last October, the book has been published. I sent it to you as soon as I received it. Just last Friday, I learned that I had earned tenure. The book took so long to finish because after a year of seizures, in January 2015, an MRI showed that I had a large brain tumor. Immediately after, I had open cranial surgery. A few days later, I basically lost the ability to speak and to write. I had chemotherapy, another surgery, and radiation, which eliminated my seizures, and I'm finally feeling about 95% better, thank God. But I still need to rest a lot, which may mean that I may not be able to join you tomorrow for Shabbat, but if I can't, I will be with you in spirit. So, are Jewish Americans a religion? Are Jewish Americans a race? This was the question that the Supreme Court justices were considering in the case Shaare Tefila Congregation v. Cobb in 1987. And this was the first time it was ever addressed there. This is because it was the first time that any case brought by Jewish communities or individuals that dealt with race had reached the Supreme Court. In the US, Jews had never been defined as either a religion or a race in legal terms. So in my book, I examine how Jewishness is legally identified in terms of religion and race in Shaare Tefila Congregation v. Cobb. My more specific question is, as I frame it now, how should both Jewish and non-Jewish Americans understand white perceived Jewish white perceived Jewish legal identification in the United States. I put white perceived in parentheses because most Americans think that Jews are white, but the perceived highlights not just the fact that not all Jews are white, but also the fact that white Jews are not white in every instance, regardless of economic status, particularly if they're at a synagogue, if they're dressed in Jewish ritual clothing, and if they have a Jewish name or wear Jewish jewelry. So please let me give you a short example from the book. So this is when I was speaking with Susan Goldsand. So I spoke with her in July 2008 about the Shaare Tefila case and about her experience of being Jewish in the US. In all outward appearances, she would be considered white. But she was not perceived that way by her boss at the YMCA-owned Julius and Garfinkel because she told me she was the first, quote, open Jew. She might be performatively white, but it would require that she conceal her Jewishness, which would mean not saying blessings over food and out loud not telling her coworkers about her weekend plans, which would include observance of Shabbat at the synagogue, and she could not bring coworkers to her house because they would see her mezuzot. She would have to recode herself as white and Christian, the religious identity that white people project and are assumed to entail. Most Americans tend to think that Jews are a religion, which is a key identifying factor for most shul-going Jews, but it hasn't always been so, nor does everyone agree. Jews have long been considered a non-white race in the United States, but after failing to rescue Jews from the horrors of Nazi Germany during World War II, and because most Jews in the US are of European or of European descent, Jewish Americans became white. Importantly, I treat religion and race as white Christian categories constructed from colonial discourses, which are and have been accepted and internalized in the US environment. In Christian terms, religion is typically based primarily on belief and choice, and race is typically defined by skin color, physical features, and sometimes the one-drop rule. Jewishness, on the other hand, is defined by birth or by conversion. So, for those of you who don't know, the Shaare Tefila congregation was defaced on November 1st, 1982, by 8 young white male local vandals, while the Board of Trustees met inside. In either red or black, they spray painted the synagogue with large swastikas, a burning cross, a Nazi eagle, the letters SS on a cement pipe used as playground equipment, the phrases "death to the Jews," "death to the Jude," Totenkampfverband, a misspelling of the Nazi death head units, and the most graphic one of all, "In take a shower, Jew," over a door. Prior to the synagogue, the 8 vandals had drunkenly defaced a pharmacy named Drug Fair, which some of you may remember at the White Oak Shopping Center. With a giant Nazi eagle, a burning cross with 3 Ks in it, the words white power, the slogan Aryan Brotherhood, a Confederate flag, a Star of David with an arrow or line running through it, and all their initials. One of them said, either, "Let's go paint a synagogue," or "Somebody should do that on a synagogue." Thus, it was important where they painted these anti-Semitic and racist images and slogans to have the greatest effect on local Jews. They all lived in or near Silver Spring, and they knew the closest synagogue was the one that you formerly inhabited, and they walked over to it. None of the Board of Trustees noticed the graffiti until after Jack Teller, when he noticed 2 swastikas on his sandalwood-colored Oldsmobile. One of them was a Nazi symbol, and the other one was a confused mess. When he and his wife Bess reached their house, He called congregation president Maurice Petoskey, may he rest in peace, and executive director Marshall Levin, who were still there. They exited the building act of graffiti after another. After consulting with Rabbi Martin Halpern, Zichrono Livracha, they decided to allow the vandalism to remain, something Jewish Americans in the 1980s had rarely, if ever, done. In 2008 and 2009, I traveled to the synagogue to interview congregants, as Rabbi Lehman mentioned, who witnessed the defacement in 1982, and some of you who are here now. You told me about your reactions and how it affected you. I learned that you had a cleanup day after the defacement in which, because of local, national, and international press, between 600 and 1,000 local folks showed up to scrub the walls along with you. When Marshall Levin discussed leaving the graffiti with Rabbi Halpern and Maurice Petoskey, he had believed that the community would show up and support you, and indeed they did. This cleanup day was extremely meaningful for you, and nearly every interviewed individual mentioned it multiple times. Thus, I understood it as critical to your experience of inclusion among your neighbors. You also mentioned your deep connections with the Colesville Council of Community Congregations, a group of churches among which you were the only synagogue, and this community rallied behind you after the defacement. Although my discussion of Shaare Tefila Congregation v. Cobb is important to the title and the substance of my book, I also want to emphasize the importance of my interviews with you and the stories that come from them. My interviews with you were so significant because they allowed me to get to know the people who experienced this vandalism and the significance of your personal stories. Also, they exemplify the synagogue as a catalyst who exposed the racist anti-Semitic graffiti not just to other local Jews, but also to the Silver Spring community. In addition, the fact that you allowed allowed the graffiti to remain had an important social impact, and it was significant in changing the ways that both non-Jewish American and Jewish Americans conceived of anti-Semitic vandalism in a symbolic fashion. It was part of a sea change and later a legal change because you saw the civil suit through to the end. You then sent some of your leaders to meet 3 of the vandals in the federal district courthouse in Baltimore to show how the defacement affected you. And finally, you used this atrocious defacement for educational purposes. You spoke about it widely in local community meetings. You made a video about the incident titled Desecration in Darkness, narrated by Milt Goldsamt, that was shown in every public high school in Montgomery County for Sensitivity Awareness Symposium Day. In doing so, you were modeling a new role of publicly grappling with your Jewish identity. And I'll return to some of these interviews at the end of my talk. But now I'd like to go to the legal case and discuss why it was so important. After the 8 vandals were identified, 3 were found guilty on criminal charges, including the ringleader, Michael Reamer. But there was no provision to specifically prevent racist or anti-Semitic graffiti in the state of Maryland, which would later be called a hate crime. There had been an increase in anti-Semitic crimes in the past few years, and this is occurring now. So at the behest of the Jewish Advocacy Center, consisting of co-founders Irvin Chappell and Kevin Lipson, which was modeled on the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Board of Trustees eventually agreed, on behalf of the congregation, to file a civil suit. Among other central Jewish organizations, such as the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, the American Jewish Committee, and the American Jewish Congress, the Jewish Advocacy Center was a bit of a renegade in wanting to bring civil suits against groups or individuals who assaulted Jews or defaced Jewish property for the sole reason that they were Jewish. However, among Jewish synagogues, Lipson told me the reaction was quite the opposite. Robert Waldman, who was a partner at Hogan and Hartson, approached him after he gave a talk at a synagogue in Arlington, Virginia, about the convictions of the 3 vandals following the defacement of Shaare Tefila, and offered to take the case pro bono. Because there was no religion-based statute, such as the First Amendment, which could apply to the vandalism of a synagogue, Patricia Brannon, one of the Shaare Tefila congregation's lawyers from Hogan and Hartson, decided to utilize the race-based Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1871. Their purpose was to further extrapolate the rights of the 13th Amendment, in part eliminated slavery. This was a hot-button issue among the Board of Trustees due to the association between Jews and race, and a source of much debate. But on February 23, 1984, the board decided to proceed. Former board member Shirley Altman told me, "Some people said they didn't feel threatened by it." I said, "Absolutely yes. I lived in England during the war. At this age," referring to the vandals, "it's not playful and it's not a prank. The paintings were so professional and it wasn't kids. When you lived as close as I did to World War II, then you could feel a shadow go down your spine." She notes how the anti-Semitic beliefs of the vandals could continue to grow if left unchecked. And for this reason, bringing the civil suit was a means of advancing your claims as a congregation on behalf of all Jews over the US. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 includes the words white citizens. However, the Shaare Tefila members who filed the suit said they were white. Jewish Americans who identify as white did not and do not generally want to associate with race, in part because of the racialized distinctions that were established by the Nazis and set into the Third Reich's legal code with the 1935 Nuremberg laws. As we all know, the racialization of Jews in the Shoah led to the mass murders of over 6 million Jews. Cognizant of this problem, Brannon argued that the vandals perceived Jews as a race, and that's why they defaced the synagogue. However, in the federal district court, Deborah Guerin, lawyer for the vandals, insisted that the synagogue could not assert that the vandals viewed them as a race because Jews are a religion. She then makes a big point about race as embodied and defined based on skin color. So in my analysis of Shaare Tefila Congregation v. Cobb in the book, I argue that the lawyers and judges focused either on embodiment of religious or racial characteristics or perceptions of religion and race. The case was denied in the federal district court because Judge Ramsey decided that Jews embodied whiteness. He determined that Jews are not a distinct race and that they are not commonly identified as a race. For him, Jews are white and not brown, and therefore not a race. In positioning himself this way, he determined that Jewish distinctions must be based on religion, as Deborah Guerin had posited. His ruling was affirmed in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which has jurisdiction over Maryland and the eastern seaboard stretching south to South Carolina. In appeals court cases, 3 judges hear cases and a majority decision determines the outcome. Judge Wilkinson, one of the judges for the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, partly dissented and wrote at length about it. Right? He was dismayed by Judge Hall's and Judge Menachen's reasoning regarding racial discrimination, and said that it should be determined based on, and who said that it should be based on embodiment. He countered, all racial discrimination or all racial prejudice is the result of subjective, irrational perceptions, which drain individuals of their dignity. because of their perceived equivalence as members of a racial group. For Judge Wilkinson, race is not limited to the narrow discourse of acknowledged and acceptable contemporary conceptions, but encompasses other notions of seemingly inherent difference that continue to permeate American culture in less easily perceptible ways. And for him, discrimination is not limited to bounded civil rights categories that are detached from histories of marginalization, but reflect misperceptions of all kinds that are historically grounded in terrorization, oppression, and murder of specific groups. He noted that some forms of racial discrimination, such as Nazism, have traversed oceans and have become implanted on American soil. Thus, he agrees with this perception approach that I argued earlier. In the Federal District Court and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, 3 of the 4 judges were persuaded that the color line governs all race-related issues, that race is an objective fact, and that Jewish Americans do not experience race-related forms of marginalization. Shaare Tefila Congregation v. Cobb came to the Supreme Court only because of Majid al-Khazraji, an Iraqi Muslim American professor who was qualified for tenure but didn't receive it in St. Francis College v. al-Khazraji, which was based in part on the Civil Rights Act of 1866. His lawyer, Caroline Mitchell, had argued that Arabs, along with other groups now perceived as, we might say, ethnicities, would have been perceived as races at the time, and not as, quote, white citizens, which she asserted based on the 39th Congress, which had constructed the act, along with dictionaries and encyclopedias published in the mid-19th century. The lawsuit won in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, so the Supreme Court had to hear these 2 cases together. In the oral argument for Shaare Tefila Congregation v. Cobb, the justices posed hypothetical examples to the synagogue's lawyer, Patricia Brannon, and then to the Vandals' lawyer, Deborah Guerin, to determine the validity of their arguments, but also to come to a decision, which would set a precedent in most cases, or it could be remanded back to a lower court. So in my book, I note the importance of Thurgood Marshall, the first Black American justice, and Antonin Scalia, the first Catholic Italian American justice, to the success of Shaare Tefila. Although they came to opposite conclusions on nearly every issue, they were both adamantly in support of Shaare Tefila Congregation because they knew what being different felt like, and they identified with it. Several notable points in the case occurred when Justice Marshall, in his interrogation of Brannon, assumed that all Jews are white, when Justice Scalia pointed out to Deborah Guerin that Jews might not follow their religion, when Marshall told Guerin about his father, who was, as he said, a Negro, and when he thundered at Guerin about the meaning of the swastika. So here's Justice Marshall asking Patricia Brannon what she would argue if the defendants had painted swastikas on the synagogue in on Lenox Avenue in Harlem, noting that, quote, there is not a white person within 10 blocks. Brannon said she would make the same argument and that the congregation should be covered just as the congregants in Shaare Tefila should be. He responded, well, you couldn't do it on race, could you? And then interrupted Brannon's response to say, but there are no Jews in that synagogue. He stopped before continuing, there are no white Jews, I would say. So what I want to note here is that Justice Marshall equates Jews and whiteness, which is the dominant perception in the 1980s and now. And I can go into more of that if you have questions about it, but I discuss more of it in the book. So in the second point, Justice Scalia continued Justice Stevens' questioning to Guerin about the religiosity of Jews when he asked, it didn't extend to Jews who were atheists, non-believers. Do you really think that was the case? She expressed uncertainty, and he continued, I mean, do you think that the prejudice that existed against Jews in this country was only against believing Jews? And so long as the Jew said, I no longer really believe in the religious tenets of Judaism, the prejudice no longer existed, and that person would be able to get into all sort of country clubs and whatnot? In this interrogation, Justice Scalia points out the slippage between the Christian conception of what religion entails, belief, and juxtaposes it with the fact that there are Jews who consider themselves secular or cultural. He wants to know if Guerin wants to limit Jews to his understanding of religion. Then, Justice Marshall asks Guerin how she would classify his father after telling her that he was white with blonde hair and blue eyes. She stated that he would be considered white and would have no cause for action under the statute which was at stake in the case. In response, he retorted, oh, but he did. He was a Negro. In referencing his father, Justice Marshall may have implied that although Shaare Tefila congregation members look white, they could also have been the victims of race-based discrimination. In the last instance that I'll mention, Marshall rejected Guerin's insistence that vandalism consisted of only religious discrimination. That's the only thing a swastika means. Death to the Jews. That's what the swastika means. Guerin responded that she understood what the Nazis believed, but did not think these beliefs are common in our society. He persisted that the swastika carries the same meaning regardless of who uses it. It means you should die, and then thundered, the word is Holocaust. The word is Holocaust. That's what the swastika means. Here, Guerin argued that the statute doesn't apply to cases in which a defendant acted out of a misperception. And I hope that you remember Brandon's assertion that the Vandals perceived Jews as a race, and because of that, committed their act of vandalism. So in all these cases, for the Supreme Court justices, because of the arguments that Brandon and Guerin made, one of the central issues was how to situate Jewish identification legally in relation to the civil rights categories of religion and race. Justice Scalia, for example, understood the key role of religion was belief, and Guerin was convinced that race could only be identified by skin color, and then one could look at a person and determine their race. When Jewish identification surpassed the boundaries of belief, they no longer fit the ways that religion was determined. As the justices struggled to make sense of the relationship between Jewish Americans and race, they also had to see beyond the ways that race had been defined in American history, because the assumption is that it is correlated with skin color. Jews as a category of people do not share a skin color. So neither Jews in general nor Jewish Americans fit this somewhat arbitrary definition used by imagined American discourse to describe groups of individuals in a socio-legal way. So now, I want to return to the Shaare Tefila congregation and your responses to the civil suit. So then Board of Trustees President Shirley Altman devoted the March 2nd, 1987 Board of Trustees meeting to the oral argument and the significance of the case. Congregation member Susan Goldsamp noted, now, as far as the Supreme Court case was concerned, I was proud as can be. I mean, that's the way it should have been dealt with. She took her 2 sons out of school to attend it. She and several interviewed congregants were adamant that the ruling should apply not only to Jews, but also to other religious and minority groups as well. Then Executive Director Marshall Levin recalled that Shaare Tefila illustrates a congregation chosen through no action of its own to play an important role in history. Justice White wrote the unanimous decision for Shaare Tefila using Caroline Mitchell's argument. He asserted that in 1866, Jews would have been viewed as a race along with Arabs, so therefore Jews could claim race-based identity in 1987. After the Supreme Court decision in 1987, the same district court judge, Judge Ramsey, heard their case because it was remanded back to the district court. Although the congregation initially pursued a verdict, what you all really wanted was a conversation with the vandals in which you could explain how you experienced the trauma. Former cantor Gershon Levin, Zichrono Livracha, told me that he could not forget painting over that one place on the synagogue, with his son on his arm, as long as the synagogue building was located on New Hampshire Avenue. Former principal of the Hebrew School and survivor of the Shoah, Harriet Steinhardt Roth, Zichrona Livracha, recalled her experience of it and how the defacement brought it rushing back. The evil. I don't begin to understand how people can be so evil, to commit what I watched, what I saw. Never mind what they did to me, but what I saw, what they did to others. And of course, I am sure that had I not been tortured like that, I might not have understood the enormity of what was being done. Because of that, because the synagogue members wanted to meet with the vandals, Judge Ramsey allowed Patricia Brannon, Rabbi Martin Halpern, and then congregant President Shirley Altman to meet them at the Baltimore District Courthouse. Rabbi Halpern showed giant photos of their graffiti to the vandals and explained their meaning, describing the horror that it evoked for the members of the congregation, particularly those who had survived the Shoah. He explained that he was one of them himself. Brannon recalled that they were very quiet, not at all defiant. And from that point, we, quote, had a remarkable conversation about why they had done this and where they had gotten those awful slogans. She noted that Rabbi Halpern approached this, quote, with a general belief that this conversation could have meaning. I found one letter of apology by Michael Reamer written on October 5th, 1988, in the congregation's records, who notably had a Jewish stepfather and stepbrothers. He explained, quote, when the desecration of the synagogue was committed, it wasn't an act of sole anti-Semitism or hatred against the Jewish people. It was just an outright act of hatred against everyone and everything. And he acknowledged that, quote, he didn't try to understand people's feelings and their values, unquote, but that he has, quote, felt remorse for the last 6 years and will feel remorse for the rest of his life, unquote. As a result of the Supreme Court ruling and the meeting with the vandals in 1988 at the Federal District Court of Appeals, Shaare Tefila congregation was able to attain legal and restorative justice. Jewish Americans can now sue for race-based protection. Shaare Tefila congregation v. Cobb set a precedent, and several cases since then have cited it, including a civil suit in response to the 2018 vandalism of Shaare Tefila congregation in Carmel, Indiana, a congregation with the same name. A married couple had spray painted 2 black swastikas with a red flag surrounding each of them, one with an iron cross on each side, on a large cement trash container behind the synagogue. In part, it was because of this congregation's courageous stance in allowing the defacement to remain on your building that this synagogue did the same. The following Monday, more than 1,000 people turned out to support them. People who spoke that night included members of other religiously, racially, and sexually marginalized communities: Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Latinx, and LGBTQ+ groups, as well as Christian pastors, priests, and a representative from the Latter-day Saints Church. Indiana did not have a hate crimes law at that time, which would have further criminalized the attack. Many of the speakers called for a hate crimes law to be enacted and asked some of the members of the audience to write to their representatives for it. When this case went to court, they cited your case, Shaare Tefila Congregation v. Cobb. However, it's important to note that this congregation is not only the site of a legal case, but is and was a Jewish space for Jewish study, prayer, friendship, and community. It is one small fraction of the larger Klal Yisrael, and more than simply a site of, quote, religion or, quote, race. When I interviewed congregants back in 2008 and 2009, former member Samuel Renson, who was a teenager at the time, recalled it was a great sense of community. At the time, we had a spectacular rabbi, Martin Halpern. Martin was just a warm, great guy. And the cantor was a fellow named Gershon Levin. And I remember training for my bar mitzvah with these two guys, and I remember growing up through some very formative years with these two individuals. They were unquestionably the heart and soul of this place. The temple was a real place where you got out more of it than you put in, because it was made up of those kinds of people. When I sat down with Sid Schwartz, he told me about his participation in daily minions. He said, "We have morning minions 7 days a week, and we have evening minions too. It's one of the few synagogues that can do it. There's one guy who will call in the morning before he goes to work, 'Do you need me to stop?' Midway through my conversation, someone came into the room where we were talking, and Sid said hi to him, which led Sid to tell me that the house we are currently living in, we're currently sitting in, was currently owned by a doctor whose wife had passed away, and that doctor was now living in an assisted living facility. Sid recalled him saying, 'The housekeeper, she stays.' When I mentioned that it seemed very nice of him, Sid said it was just characteristic of our core members of this congregation. Clearly, the core members here care deeply for one another and are invested in the future of the synagogue. It has its own ever-changing life, with the individual lives of many people contributing to it. I am so happy that I've had the opportunity to visit you on Shabbat, 14 years after I initially came. With book in hand, it has been a long process, and it has been the most meaningful process of my life. When I recovered from cancer, this book is what I wanted to put out into the world. And this book was the most important thing that I felt like I could contribute. I've checked in periodically with Rabbi Lehman and your lawyer for the case, Patricia Brannon, and former Jewish Advocacy Center, Kevin Lipson. This entire time, it's been so important to me to return to your synagogue and share my book with you. Thank you again for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Annalise, for sharing those words with us. And we are grateful for you to have reached out to me to be here this evening to share that history with us. So I think we have time for some questions, if you're willing to take, if anybody has any questions from Annalise's presentation. Wendy. So wait, before you answer, for the people who might be watching on live stream, I just want to repeat, Wendy Abraham is asking a question. Wendy is a child product of this congregation, and so she's part of, and Shaare Tefila is part of her. She asked Annalise, how did she come to find out about this and to write about it?
Thank you so much. I actually found out about it from this book called by Eric Goldstein called, what was it called? Put down my, it's The Price of Whiteness is the title, and I really recommend it. It's a really great book. I just noticed it in a, something that was like he just mentioned it, and so I was like, oh, that seems very interesting. So I read the oral argument, and then I was like, no one's ever written about this. This is really important. So I decided to make it my dissertation. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Yes,
Thank you so much. That was such a moving talk. Thank you. Well, I understand the logic. That is the legal argument that we are viewing the Jewish community through a race-based lens. I guess I'm just so surprised that there were no, and I guess are no, statutes on the books that would prevent religious-based crimes like this. The statutes are all about race. There are no other kinds of statutes on the books. I'm just so surprised to hear that. Maybe this goes a bit outside the purview of the talk. But I don't know, I was just wondering if, is that really right? There are no religious,
So, do I need to be up here? So one of the things that's important about that is the, excuse me, religious-based statutes are come from the First Amendment generally, and from the free exercise and the establishment clauses, but there has to be government or state or local action behind that, and so there has never been that. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not an attorney, but I thought hate crime laws were not necessarily racial. They could be for violence against homosexuals. So would that not, since it encompasses the perception of the perpetrator, would not a religious animosity be included as a hate crime? So it's covered equally. Is it not?
So this is a very good question. It's not, actually, because hate crimes cover particular items, but not defacement of synagogues, and not anything that's particular to, like, a property or something like that. Violence against a person, and other sorts of things. Like I could kind of look at on my computer and tell you like all the things that they cover, but yeah. It became a crime. Yeah, it became a hate crime. Yeah. There are a bunch of different things that are covered by hate crimes laws, but this was the first time that it could become, like, there were other, like, previous hate crimes laws, but not with this particular circumstance. Yeah.
So with the rise of, that the ADL has pointed out, the rise of anti-Semitic acts in our country, and as here in Montgomery County and in the public schools, the rise of anti-Semitism, how would the individuals affected by these anti-Semitic acts, how could they respond legally to what's happening?
Yeah, so they could respond because of this case. Yeah, and actually, the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith changed its response. I didn't say this in my talk, but they changed its response to covering it up to letting the community come and support. And so that was in response to what Shaare Tefila congregation did.
If there are no other questions or comments, we just want to thank Annalise once again for we want to thank her for doing all this work. We're pleased to be able to honor her, recognize her for bringing our synagogue to national attention, and most importantly, to pray for your continued good health. And Mazel Tov on your tenure as well. I hope that's. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and have a good evening. Drive safe.